It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Gnade here to talk about one of our newer buildings, I guess it's a couple of years now, Natural Science and Engineering Research Building. I have to tell you this very short, brief story because UTD is a very young university. Up until 1969, it belonged to Texas Instruments and was used as an advanced research area. And they gave it to the state on the condition that they would put a university here. So that is how UTD was born. There was one building here on 200 or 300 acres, and it was here all by itself, and it was very ominous because Southwest Center for Advanced Research was scary. And this was in 1969. But if you have connections here and you haven't been on campus for a while, or if you don't have connections here and would like to drive around and see construction, drive around the campus. Because as you come in off of Campbell, a year and a half ago, there were no trees. And now, I don't know how many thousand have been planted out there. The building is going up everywhere in all directions. And I always think back to that 1969 when there was one lonesome building out here. And now it is just a major university complex with buildings and schools and everything else going on. So it's really a sight to see. I think we're up to about 16,000 plus students now.
18,000 starting next week. 18,000
I'm
next
sorry,
week.
I retired a year and a half ago, so I'm out of touch. 18,000, so that's the way it's growing. But anyhow, we're pleased to have Dr. Gnade to talk about the Natural Science and Engineering Research Building, which is beautifully designed building, and I'll let you take it from there.
Very good. Thanks, Jim.
So first off, I want to thank Jerry for inviting me. When I was telling Jim when Jerry asked me this, it's been several months ago. He said, Bruce, would you be interested in talking about our Natural Science and Engineering Building? I thought it was going to be a group of sort of 15 people and maybe everybody had a donut and coffee. So this is a much bigger deal than I expected. So, my other caveat before I start, and I hope you're not too disappointed. The last talk was great. Talk about a big project. So they were showing they'll spend $65 million a month at the peak. The whole building costs $65 million. So we're kind of piddly compared to the previous talk. But hopefully all those things aside, that there'll be something that you might find of interest. The other thing, before I start, is that I really know absolutely nothing about project management. I'm an electronic materials guy. I build devices on plastic. Most of my research is funded by the Department of Defense. I happen to be the guy that missed the meeting the day when the money was approved to get the building built. We had a new dean, and somebody's like, well, gosh, who's going to be the project manager for UTD? And since I wasn't there, I was the project manager. I'm not sure that's how it works in the real world, real project management. That was my first lesson. Don't miss the first meeting. So, given the fact that I did miss the first meeting, you're going to see probably a lot of the mistakes that we made along the way. But, hopefully in the end the building turned out to be, we think it's a great building, both from the standpoint of being aesthetically pleasing and different, for sure, but also from a science and engineering standpoint. It's been a great tool for us. As Jim said, we've grown from, I started here in 2003, we've gone from 11,000 kids in 2003 to over 18,000 starting next week. We have gone from, in 2003, about $25 million in research expenditures to we'll be over $100 million this year. Number of faculty has grown from about 230 to 450. And all these things are on track to where, in hopefully 7 to 10 years, we'll have 25,000 students, 1,000 faculty, and be doing roughly $300 to $350 million a year in research. Our goal is to look like schools like the University of California at San Diego, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Virginia, the outstanding, great public institutions, that have done a great job being both great undergraduate universities as well as great research universities. So, we're trying to get on that track. One of the very first things that when Dr. Daniel was coming was, gosh, we need to hire more faculty to do research, and that's really what has led, partly to the building. And so hopefully, by the time we're finished today, you'll excuse me for not knowing anything about project management, but maybe it'll at least be enjoyable. So, with that, I was going to talk a little bit. So, when this all started, in 2000, right at the end of 2003, and I'll give a few details. TI teamed up with the university and the UT system to start what we call Project Demo. It was, how are we going to make the engineering school at UT Dallas a better institution? And because of that, between the system and between the state and between some other public funds, there was a commitment to $200 million to the University of Texas at Dallas to improve the engineering school. Part of that was going to be to build a new building. Well, part of the issue with not being at the meeting was, gosh, not knowing what I was getting into. So, in December of that year, this is what the site looked like. I mean, we just kind of had an open spot that we didn't even cut the grass on. I mean, it was just pretty much a dump. And so this is where we started in November 2003, and from there, I'm going to try to give you how this all turned into the building that we have today, where we had promised to move in by December 31st of 2006. And that's from my standpoint, anyway, that's an important date to keep in mind, because contractually we had committed to the state of Texas that we would move in before January 1st, 2007. So everything we did was geared towards that date. That was, now, I don't know, maybe they shot me as the guy that's supposed to do it or whatever, but, we had said we will move in by January 1st, 2007. So that's what drove the schedule. So we went from not even thinking about a building and having a big open spot out there that was kind of a dump to, moving into a building in a fairly short period of time. So, we'll go through the schedule a little bit, how we did the planning, and because the time was short, the planning was actually pretty compacted. And I'll show you a few pictures, but having never done this before, I was absolutely amazed that you could start digging the basement before the top was designed. We were pouring concrete in the basement before the second and third floor design was complete, even, because that was the only way they felt like we could hit the schedule that we had to do. And you'll see, we didn't have any extra floors or anything when we got done, but that did actually raise some issues. Cost ended up being a big issue, and we'll go through that. If you remember, that was the time shortly after Hurricane Katrina. So, copper had gone through the roof. You couldn't buy concrete. You couldn't buy shingles. You couldn't buy drywall. So, about halfway through the design, all of a sudden, there was a bunch of materials that were going to cost 50% more than what were projected in the original cost. And just from the standpoint of how it was done, the general contractor ended up being Centex, and it was contract management risk. So, we had this much money, they had to build the building. And, and how are we going to do that and still not just be completely out of whack? So, cost got to be a fairly significant burden at points along the way. In the end, the building is cool. I mean, without a doubt, I think it's one of the neatest science and engineering buildings you can see, and I'll try to show you what it is, and then a little bit about lessons learned when we get to the end. And those lessons learned, a lot of them are things that you guys would know anyway. I mean, it really came down to, us not understanding what we were probably doing to some extent, but even more so than that, I think it was driven by the fact that we were trying to do things probably faster than maybe what we could have or should have. So we did a few things wrong, but hopefully that, you'll forgive us for that. So, this was the schedule that you can, as a scientist and an engineer, I got a big green light. So you can see, the building was approved at the end of 2003. That's when the funding all came about. And as I said, it was part of this project debit. $85 million for the building, $200 million overall. And just as a tidbit of history, that was, if you remember, Texas Instruments had said they were going to build a new 12-inch fab over on Renner Road. Or possibly they would build it on Renner Road. The other option was to either go to New York or to go to Singapore. And what they wanted from the state was a commitment to make UT Dallas a better engineering school. If the state would commit to that, they would build a facility over on Renner Road. So that's how the actual thing got started. And for us, a bunch of us here up here worked at TI. I worked there for 15 years. It was one of the best things that happened. Instead of Texas Instruments saying, we want this tax abatement, we want this rebate, we want this, they said, the state needs to put money into UT Dallas. If you do, we'll stay. And that's how all this ended up happening in the end. So, it was a great thing from the university standpoint. And from TI, I mean, they could have easily asked for their own stuff instead of for us. But, so, just as an overall schedule, so this all kind of starts, the programming and all in January of 2004. And as I said, we committed that we would be occupying the building by 12/31/2006. And literally, nobody even thought about building at this point, when we started. So it was really, really, really from scratch. And this just goes through, sort of what the programming schedule was, how long we had to get schematics done, and then to finish DDs. And then, as I said, we started construction on November 2004, and the construction documents were only actually finished for the basement at that point. So, as the other bid packages, we started construction for bid package 3 and bid package 4 went out. And as you'll see in a little bit, that made a big problem because bid package 3 was about $15 million over budget. So, but at that point we already had the hole in the ground and it was going to be hard to make, significant changes to what was going to go on. So, and it came up earlier about, how do you make sure that you get the folks involved that are going to need to make the decisions. From the UT system standpoint, any building that's over, I don't know what the exact number is, it's 10 million or 15 million, but anything that gets bigger than that, the Board of Regents actually have to approve the conceptual design of the building. Not just that you're going to have a building, but they have to approve what the look of the building is. So, early on, and before very much was done, I mean, we were in the really early stages, the architects, the design architects, which was a group from California, Zimmer, Gunsel, Kraska, came up with this rendering and conceptual design. I guess I should mention Page Sutherland. Page was the architects of record here in Dallas. But so they came up with design and potential place to put it, built some mock-ups, and went to, at the time, Miss Clements, Rita Clements was the board regent that represented the Dallas area. They went to Miss Clements, took Miss Clements to lunch and said, gosh, this is what we're thinking about. Is this going to be something you think is going to be acceptable to the Board of Regents? And do you think that, we can get this idea passed before we go on very far? Miss Clements, had some suggestions, but they were fairly minor, but she bought into it early on in the process. And it was because of that, I believe, that the Board of Regents approved it. I don't think that building would get approved today with the current Board of Regents. Because we've had other buildings we've tried, and, gosh, guys, that's not square enough, or, gosh, it's not brown. Getting Miss Clements to buy in at the beginning, when it came time for the architects and the president to present it to the Board of Regents, she'd already convinced enough people that this was the right thing to do. And so we had no pushback at all, at that design phase. So that, I think, was a really, because, with the schedule, if it had come down and said, no, we don't like the design, we'd have had to go back and start from there. It would have never gotten finished in time. So, Ms. Clements, you should get all the credit in the world for what she did to help us make sure that this was going to move forward. So, this was kind of the mock-up. And it's the building looks quite a bit like this, after we kind of all was said and done. And again, I think partly because we have great design architects. These guys build these kind of buildings. This is what they do. They had a pretty good idea of what we could get for the money that we had, and so it went pretty quickly. But just, if you're not familiar with campus, to give you an idea, this is Synergy, and this is Rutgers. So it sits up on the north side of campus, sort of the northeast piece a little bit. At the time, the reason, and so several people have asked, why'd you pick up there? It's not in the main part of campus. The building has, it's a research building. So it doesn't have undergraduate teaching classes, it doesn't have undergraduate laboratories. We actually have a clean room, so we use things like silane and diborane and arsine. And so the idea was, it probably doesn't need to be sitting next to a lot of classrooms. It probably would be good that if it was off, up the edge. So this was, and it ends up that the architects liked it because the creek, I think this is actually Cottonwood Creek, runs through here, and it was all, so there was a good reason for why it was picked where it was, I think, and it was a nice open spot. So that was kind of how we first got to buy it, so we were good to go. So, given that Ms. Clements said, yeah, I think I can, we can live with that, it looks good, we started writing down what are the main criteria that need to go into the building or that don't go into the building and try to work from there. So one of the very first was, it's not going to have classrooms. And that was partly driven by, we were mainly limited on campus at that point in research and laboratory space for faculty. The growth hadn't quite taken off in terms of the number of students, but we were very, very much limited in the amount of research space we had. So it's okay, our biggest need is laboratory space and not classrooms. So we said no classrooms. The other was, it needed to be interdisciplinary. And that was driven by, because, and I still believe this today, where, really cutting edge research and one of the things that make a lot of difference these days is really at the interdisciplinary edges between, biology, chemistry, engineering. So there's a good science engineering reason for doing that. The other good reason for doing it was, our chemistry building was full, our physics building was full, our biology building was full. We weren't going to get another chemistry building, another physics building, another biology building. So we were going to have to be able to take those new people and put them together and help them work together, rather than thinking we're going to build new buildings for everybody. So it was going to be interdisciplinary because of the science, but I think also just from a practical standpoint. The other was is that we had a clean room in the old Engineering North building, but it really wasn't up to speed in terms of safety and toxic gas monitoring. Also, we wanted to close it down, and so we needed to have a spot for the clean room. So it was going to have a clean room in it. The other was is that okay, gosh, we're going to spend $85 million. What can we get for our $85 million? How many people can we put in the building? So the idea was let's maximize the number of research groups that we can put in. So one of the first sort of planning exercises is what does a research group look like? So, what's your canonical research group? And, working with the architects and the design guys, they've built several buildings like this not too far ahead of ours. One was at Cornell, one was at UC San Diego, one was for the FDA. Research group, faculty member for 8 to 10 graduate students and 1 or 2 postdocs. So 10 to 12 people would constitute a research group. So we wanted to have as many of those kinds of groups in the building as possible. Part of that is so that we can train as many students as possible. Part of that is that each one of these groups probably takes about $500,000 a year of research funding to run. And so, we were shooting for, gosh, could this help us improve our research funding portfolio by $15 to $20 million by having a building like this? So, we came up with this canonical research group. And then the other thing was that, we really wanted to make the space as flexible as possible for long term. People come and go, research comes and goes, how do we make the building work? And part of this even goes back to TI days. If you were at TI, if you were ever in the Central Research Laboratory building there, all the walls were movable in that building. They were big, long, open hallways. All of the infrastructure went down through movable walls that you could take out. So you could make labs big, small, do whatever you wanted. And the other thing that was unique about the Central Research Lab there is that all of the infrastructure, pumps, compressors, gases, all this kind of stuff, there was always a pipe space below, so you could do that. So how are we going to do those kind of things in a research lab? But so we wanted this flexibility that we could do biology, we could do chemistry, we could do electrical. So the planning process, for most academic projects, doesn't really matter what it is. It takes several years because you get a bunch of people together, you have a bunch of committees, and everybody votes, and you go back and you vote again, and you just keep doing it. Well, luckily, we had about 2 months to do the plan, so we didn't have very many committees, and we didn't have very many votes, because it could have drug on a very long time, I think. But the way we did it, and again, the architects were a great help. We said, okay, we think people from probably electrical engineering, material science, biology, chemistry, and behavioral brain science are probably the kind of people that are going to be in the building. Working with the lab designers, we set up a list of questions. We gave it to a representative group of the faculty. We said, okay, what are the things that are important to you guys? Is it how much bench space that you have? Is it, that you have this little spot that you want to put a piece of equipment? What is it that you really believe you need? And then, okay, gosh, if it's available, what would be nice to have? So, we collected all these up from, a group of people. There's probably about 25 faculty that were involved in this initial planning process. Consolidated with people said, gosh, I just can't live without this, versus it'd be kind of cool to have this. And what came out of that is that rather than thinking about building labs for a chemist or a biologist or a BBS guy or whatever, the main thing that varied from group to group or from person to person was how many fume hoods they used. Chemists typically use quite a few fume hoods, but that's what some of our biologists and biochemists do as well. Where most of the engineers, like myself, it's more like, we just need open space. We're going to put equipment in and all. So what we did, we came up with labs that, instead of saying it was a chemistry lab, we came up with labs based on hood density. We have labs that don't have very many fume hoods in. We have labs that have some fume hoods in. And we have labs that have a lot of fume hoods in. And then based on that, depending on what your needs are, if you're going to be in the building, you'll get teamed up with folks in that kind of lab. Rather than saying, here's a chemistry lab, only chemists are going to go in here. Do you need fume hoods or not? If you do, we'll put you in a high-density fume hood lab. So, when you walk around the building, there isn't a floor for chemistry, there's not a floor for biology. There's a wing that has people that use hoods. There's another wing with people that don't use hoods. And everybody gets mixed up. And it ends up, while that was partly by design, it's really worked out great, because we do it. I'll give you some examples. We have people from not only across disciplines, but different universities. We have guys from Southwestern that spend time here now because of the kind of lab space that we have as well. So, so we came up with these prototype labs and did some mock-ups and some drawings and all. Came back with the faculty for a second time. And again, okay guys, this has to happen pretty quickly. So, give them a couple weeks to think about it a little bit and not think too much. And finally, came up with, okay, we're going to give you some mock-ups of what we really think this is going to look like. And oh, by the way, there's a good chance you're not going to be one of the guys in the building anyway. I mean, we really don't know who's going to go in the building. It may well be new people. So, let's be open-minded here and think about, what would somebody else like in the building to look like as well. So, this whole process from going from, not even thinking about it to having a conceptual design for what the lab would look like happened in about 2.5 or 3 months. It went fairly quickly to get that done. And again, all the credit in the world goes to the design architects. I mean, they brought in lab designers. They brought in guys that designed actual, chemistry labs. And the design guys were just absolutely outstanding in making all this happen. So, you know, it ends up that as we go forward, you know, what we're sort of out of that planning process, you know, what were we going to be able to do given the money that we had? And even from the beginning, you know, we knew we had $61 million of construction money. You know, the guys that do this for a living said, okay, gosh, you know, for the kind of space on average, you know, sort of office space, like it's going to cost you somewhere around $300 a square foot. You know, or if you take in all the costs, it's about $400 a square foot. So we knew it could be probably on the order of 200,000 square feet. But what we came up with after going through all this process is that probably the best thing that we could do from a utilization standpoint would be 4 floors with a basement. We'd probably have about enough space for 40 research groups. So, you know, we said there's 10 to 12 people in a group, so we were somewhere between 400 and 500 people would probably occupy the building, you know, depending on, you know, what kind of stuff they did. Because the space is expensive, no things like departmental offices. You know, the departmental offices typically can be very, you know, fairly big and not be all that useful. So, you know, the space is too expensive for departmental offices, we decided. You know, and there really weren't going to be departments there anyway. So, you know, why have that kind of office space? So that kind of went out. We had, clean room would go in, it would be about 5,000 square feet. I'll give you a few more details on that. And then the other thing that was decided, and I think it ended up being a great idea that the architects suggested, we have a lot of what we call core facilities on campus. You know, things like the materials characterization stuff, TEM, SCM, SIMS. So, you know, typically you'll put that in a multi-user building like this. You're building great space, why don't we do that? So we did put in things like, you know, the characterization capabilities, autoclaves, a bunch of cold rooms that the biologists can use. So a lot of sort of common area space, you know, that multiple people. So typically the things that are in this common space, you know, it's not a particular group, it's not even a particular school or department, typically it's across campus. So, you know, we have a lot of people come to the building to use these facilities just for that. So, if you look at it, you know, the overall design came out then, you know, 192,000 square feet. The basement has all of the microscopy and imaging and all that because the way the basement is set up, you know, remembering that this is synergy, on that end we actually hit rock, and so we had to go down into the rock on that end. So this part of the building in the basement is mechanically and physically isolated from the rest of the building. It's a free-floating structure. You know that it's cut from the building where there's an actual rubber gasket that isolates it. So all the high-resolution imaging stuff is on that end, and it sits on bedrock. So, you know, we just have a new aberration-corrected TEM. You know, for those of you guys that don't think about this stuff so much, the resolution for that microscope is 0.78 angstrom. You know, most atoms are sort of an angstrom and a half. So it has better than atomic resolution. So it has to be pretty quiet down there. So, you know, it literally sits on bedrock. And just to show you the kind of sensitivity that you have to worry about in a building like this, so that new TEM sits right about there. There's an elevator that sits here in the corner. If that elevator goes up and down, even though the building is physically isolated, the induced magnetic field due to that elevator interacts with the imaging down here. So the spaces have to be, you know, specifically designed for these kind of things. So, you know, when we were doing this, even though we only finally got the money last year to buy the microscope, we had the microscope vendors come in and tell us, this is what this space should look like. I mean, you're going to need to have this RMS peak-to-peak variation in, you know, vibrations in the floor and stuff. So, you know, we tried to dial as much of that in as we could early on in order not to have to come back and fix things later. So, basement, and then if you look, the other 4 floors all are kind of the same. They're just different combinations of hoods and not hoods, except for the first one. It's the only piece that's a little bit different, and that's because the clean room sits here. And this is the 5,000 square feet clean room with some cases. So what it comes down to is that each one of these wings has about 8,000 square feet of lab space. You know, and you can see that we had 7 wings basically, because this one doesn't count. But so 8,007, so we ended up with about 60,000 square feet of actual lab space that was usable. The other thing that was certainly different for us in terms of an academic building is that the offices, and you'll see some pictures of all this, all sit right outside your lab. So if your research group, and a group now is not only 1 faculty member, it's probably more like 4 or 5 that are sharing one of these wings, maybe 3 depending on how big. The faculty offices are nearby their lab, and these are cubicles where the students and postdocs sit. So it's an open plan space. Part of that driven by less expensive. Part of it is you'll see it helps with the lighting and all, but the other part is that kids are going to work in cubicles when they graduate. I mean, you know, part of the motivation was is that you need to learn to live in those kind of spaces. That's just the way it's going to be. So, you know, it's set up to look much more like an industrial lab probably than what you would normally see on an academic campus. But, so, yeah, first floor has clean room, everybody else is all this interdisciplinary office space stuff. So, just as one example, you know, on the first floor, and you know, it ended up, it almost does look like this but this was after the planning process. First floor next to the clean room. What might go in there? Well, what we were thinking about is that, you know, we have guys, in electrical engineering that build MEMS devices, that build, you know, small electronic circuits, some microfluidics, and we have guys in neuroscience that use those devices. We have a group that does, you know, neural implants, things like that. You know, so the electrical engineering guys make stuff, the neuroscience guys use stuff. You know, why wouldn't it make a lot more sense for them to sit together rather than the neuroscience guys sitting down at the Center for Brain Health and the electrical engineer sitting over in the north end of the electrical engineering building? So, you know, and besides that, they use the clean room a lot. So, you know, this is an example of the kind of things that we try to do is, you know, not put it together by discipline, but put it together by people that work together. And in the end, that has actually worked quite well. It works, I think, pretty well because the people, to some extent, self-organized. You know, we didn't force anybody to sit anyplace. You know, it was, okay guys, here's an opportunity for you guys to work together. If you had your chance and you wanted to put a team of 5 or 6 faculty together to work in this area, who would be the best 5 or 6 guys that can be the most productive by being together? So the self-organization, you know, people pick who they like to work with. And it really has, it's worked quite well. Now, on the other hand, when you said, you know, gosh, Joe and Bill and, you know, Jill, you and all sit here, it probably wouldn't have been so good. You know, faculty space, if you're not from university, you know, it is the most coveted thing anybody can have. You know, and I'm not sure why, but it is. You know, typically people sort of will their space as they die to the next young guy that's coming in. You know, and then it probably takes a couple years to go through probate to make sure that it gets willed to the right guy. So space is, so the idea of sharing space is a pretty foreign concept to most faculty members. I mean, most people, you know, there's my 600 square feet, you know, I'm the only guy that has a key to that room. There's no windows, no, you know, you can't see in because I'm doing really cool stuff, and, you know, and it's messy, so you wouldn't understand anyway. But so, you know, the idea of getting people to work together, you know, was a bit of a risk probably when we started this. I mean, you know, and luckily it's worked out great. You know, people, you know, the guys that have moved into the building have truly embraced it. You know, other things that we've done are things like, you know, mixed biochemistry, microbiology, and it ends up this reserve for space. These are a couple of our bioengineering guys fit in there. So, you know, it has mixed up, and in the end, it really was all about, you know, how do we try to make it the most efficient we can from a multidisciplinary standpoint. You know, when I put this together a year or two ago for a different venue, the 4th floor hadn't been finished out. Well, since then, we've hired several bioengineers, and now the 4th floor is where the bioengineering space is. But again, part of the idea is to make it flexible enough that it's not a big deal to set it up for a particular group, you know, way a group wants to work. And hopefully you'll see that as we go through how that kind of works. So what did the building cost? You know, the total project budget was $85 million. The total construction budget was $61.3 million. And, you know, this just kind of shows what the estimates were when we started. And if you remember, you know, bid package 1 was all the excavation and digging the hole and all that kind of stuff. Bid package 2 was all the concrete, just building the mechanical stuff. You know, at the end of bid package 2, we were a couple $1 million under budget. You know, this is going really well. Bid package 3 was electrical, mechanical, and plumbing, and that's the one that came in at $15 million over budget. You know, it ended up being, you know, a much bigger chunk than what anybody expected, and that was partly because the building is extremely complicated too. But this kind of shows, you know, what the initial estimates were, and then how it had to change a little bit as we go along. So, and I've mentioned most of these things already, but, you know, sort of the unique features we think about the building is this idea of using cubicles or open plan seating. You know, the kind of rooms, low, medium, and high. You'll see the lab furniture is extremely modular. I'll show you some specialty labs that we have, or characterization space that we have. And then, you know, the other things, and I probably will forget to mention it otherwise, every faculty office in this building is exactly the same. You know, if you ever go to Rice, they have it's a really cool building actually on campus, but it has 8 or 9 sides. It's a really odd-shaped building. And, you know, the first time I visited, gosh, why'd you guys build a building this way? Well, because we can have more window offices for the faculty. And that's truly what drove them to build the building that way, so there'd be more offices with windows for faculty. So, nobody has a window in this building in a faculty office. So, you know, nobody argues about, gosh, your office is better than mine. Everyone's exactly the same. And everybody complains. So, That's okay, because I don't sit in that building. So, some of the first concepts, the mock-ups that the guys did, for the architects, okay guys, this is the glass wall, where light can come in, and these would be, sort of what the cubicles would look like. This is what we envision for labs. These might be specialty labs. And so, this was kind of the overarching things that we wanted to go into that design was, beautiful building with, great windows on the outside. How do we get that light to as many people as we possibly can? So let's try to get the natural light through. And what that did was partly to drive these cubicles, but also to drive the fact that the walls on the cubicles are quite short. So the light does come in and go all the way through. The other thing that it drove was that all the labs have windows. It's a glass wall. All the labs sit behind a glass wall. So as you walk by the laboratories, you can see in completely. And, there are several reasons. One is it does let the natural light in, and the other is for a safety standpoint. If somebody's in there working, if something spills, something happens, there's always people, out here working where you can see it. So, the labs are extremely open for you to be able to see what's going on. So we had the collaboration areas, the close proximity to the offices. I think that's another really neat feature to the building. If you're a faculty member and your lab sits along here, your office is right here, and your students are right here. It's not like my office is at the end and the students have to come down to find me, or it's not that, more typical thing is the kids will say, well, gosh, I was working. And I go, well, no, you weren't, because I was just there. So, it does drive, also an attitude and, sort of how people work. It's been great. But so this was kind of the mock-up that got shown to the faculty originally and said, okay, guys, what's wrong with this? What do we need to fix? And so we went from there to this is kind of what it looks like, and I'll show you some better ones eventually, but, this is the glass wall looking into the laboratories. The offices would be about where this guy is here. All of the stuff in this lab is very portable and movable. You can see that, the benches aren't attached, the cabinets aren't attached, all of the utilities above drop down. So, these shelves where you might store chemicals and all, they can come out. Literally, you can take all of this stuff out probably in 3 or 4 days' time. The data lines all drop down from the ceiling, the compressed gases drop down from the ceiling. These umbilicals even, which look relatively permanent, they're only there just to help run some lines down that can run across the top. And mainly, the main motivation even for them is to have the safety showers. So they really can come out pretty quickly too. They're not very permanent in reality. The idea was, I have 8,000 square feet. Not everybody's going to want their 8,000 feet to be exactly the same even after hoods come and go and whatnot. But if I have a big piece of equipment, what I want to put here, literally it's 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here, the cabinets come out, you roll these out and pick the tables up and move them out. So it's fairly quick and easy to reconfigure the space. Now, there's premium to pay for that because the hardware and all is a little bit more expensive. And the estimate, whether or not this is true, I have no idea. But when we were going through the design, the engineers and the architects of the design said it probably adds about 10% to the cost of the building to make it flexible like this. But the goal is that long term we would save that by not spending money on renovations and fixing things up later on. So there is some additional cost. Now, the other extreme was, and we visited it at the time, was a building at Stanford called the Clark Center, where literally a floor was just open. There was no physical structures attached to anything. Even the offices were portable. Sinks were portable. Everything could move, and that actually doubled the cost of that building. But it was the only one that's ever been built like that. I think the people just had a cool idea, but it just cost too much. So we tried to hit something that was a bit more in between. This is looking out from the back of the lab out, so you can see that the light does come in. You can see all the way out to the outside. While there's very good lighting in the laboratories, even if the lights are off during the day, you can see quite well. But the other thing, just to point out, is these are sort of the general spaces that a lot of people share. And then at the back end here, there are several on each of those wings. There are 6 or 7 of what we call specialty laboratories. Normally what happens with these is that, you have 3 or 4 faculty sharing this. Each one of the faculty members probably has 1 or 2 of these specialty areas. He does just his stuff. Maybe it's laser spectroscopy, so it needs to be dark. Or, maybe it's, some sort of printing technology, that needs to sit in a special environment. But so, while most of the space is shared, there's also some space that's sort of dedicated to particular projects. I think that made it a bit more sellable to the faculty as we were doing it too, rather than thinking, gosh, all of my stuff is always going to be out in the open for everybody to use. Now, a bunch of stuff is shared, but there are bits and pieces that, maybe that if it's unique to your work, wasn't there. So, Same lab that I showed you before, except up one floor, but here we were going to put in this huge piece of equipment, so none of this stuff is there. But we can make it look just like that other lab within a matter of a few days, because all of the infrastructure is above, even the posts are hanging, and all the connections, everything is there. You could put those tables back in, and you could put the hanging brackets back in, and be good to go. But in this particular case, there's a big piece of equipment, and I couldn't find a picture with it in, but it literally takes up about 4,000 square feet of the 8,000. One big piece that had to go there. So it does show that flexibility. Now, at some point, this is all based on doing research on, scaled silicon CMOS. When scaled silicon CMOS gets happening, Bob may decide to do something else, and this piece of equipment may go out, and we can put the lab back together in a different way at that point. One of the other things that's fairly unique about building are these linear equipment chases. And this is where, and this is before everything got moved in, but this is where all the pumps, all the refrigerators, all the compressed gases, all of the compressors, everything that's noisy, dirty, all that kind of stuff, sits in the back of the laboratories. If you're in typical buildings, this stuff would be in a chase that runs right down the middle. It's about 3 feet wide, it's dark, and there's rats and everything else in there. This is actually a pretty nice space, and then you've got lots of light, lots of windows, it's easy to work on things. And the way everything is set up in the building is that all of the infrastructure runs overhead, and then there are specific places along the wall where you can take things in. So there are areas that have been dedicated to gases going in. There are areas that are dedicated to where liquids go in. There are areas dedicated to where the electricity goes in. And we kind of have a rule, nobody violates those spaces except for what's supposed to go in there. So it maintains the overall management of what goes where in the building. And we've done fairly well, but in the way we have the sort of the rules of the building are that you can put anything in here if it's fairly permanently attached. Like, you've actually plumbed it in. You have to leave 8 feet wide down the middle so that we can move equipment in and out. If it's bigger than 8 feet, it better be movable fairly easily because at some point somebody may want to move something down that hallway. And then some of the other things that I think that we're really, from a safety standpoint, we have lots of kids in the building working all the time. So we worried a lot about, how do we actually manage chemical storage, for instance. So on each wing, there's a fairly large chemical storage room. You only take into the lab the chemicals you need for that day. Everything else stays in the storage room. So the amount of chemicals that are actually in the working space at any one time are relatively small. The freight elevator sits back here, so chemicals never go out where the people sit. They come up the back, and then they come around the back of the lab to be put in the chemical storage room and then taken into the lab. So there was a lot of safety issues that went into the design of the building as well. And the guys did a great job doing that. So this just kind of shows, and we kind of talked a little bit, we have 48 faculty offices, 288 postdoc or cubes, 4 small conference rooms. They all sit on the basement, so it's not going to show me. 4 large conference rooms and 1 seminar room. So we do have some, but no classrooms. I mean, in these large and small conference rooms, this is sort of a 10 people one, these are about 20 people. And then the seminar room was about 75 people. So, sort of how did things go, in terms, again, because things went fairly quickly. It worked out great. As a University of Texas System school, the oversight goes to OFPC, the Office of Financial and Physical Construction, something like that, I don't know. But, so, these guys worry about all the construction that goes on any UT system campus. They do all the inspections, they do all the walkthroughs, they make sure that everything's going the way it's supposed to. So Howie and Jerry and Ray took care of all this. There's a management team from RPC, Tom London Schiller, with our project managers. So, Tom lived here during this project and was in the trailer every day with the contractors and all. And then Jerry was the senior guy downstairs. As I said, Centex was the construction manager at risk, so they were the general contractor. Dusty and Juan were the senior program manager and program managers. And we were talking a little bit yesterday. I was telling Jerry and the guys that when we came in $16 million over, $15 million over on the bid for bid package 3, Dusty was no longer with Centex, so we changed project managers halfway through too. So that was a bit of a start, when we had to start over. Architects of record were Paige Sutherland Page, Brent D. Design architects were Zimmer Gunsel Frasca from Los Angeles. Lab architects were a group called GCM. So they brought in really great people to do all this. And then nobody's left pretty much, except for you. Everybody else is gone at this point. So that's one of the big advantages of having tenure. Gosh, I didn't like what I did. So there are some advantages. Even though I think tenure is a bad idea. Gosh, just except for me. So when all this, so we started construction. Groundbreaking was November 15th of 2004. So, sort of 6 months into it. You look at the schedule, and you know, gosh, you guys know a whole lot more about all these planning tools and scheduling tools. I mean, Centex had these spreadsheets that were bigger than the trailer, you know, and all this stuff. You know, and this has to be done by Tuesday at 3 o'clock, you know, and this has to be done Friday by 1:30. You know, literally at that level. And so in 2005, in June, you know, gosh, we're cooking along. You know, things are about where we, you know, think they should be, except for, you know, a few things were behind schedule, but where the finish date was still June 30th, 2006. And, you know, okay, gosh, you know, maybe we slipped a little here, but we still had, yeah, we still had, you know, 24 days of flow. You know, we were just cooking with gas at that point. You know, we used 43% of the days, and I don't know, 26% of the money. I mean, we were keeping track of all that stuff. And then bid package 3 came in. And it goes, oh my gosh, you know, we are $14.8 million over budget. So, you know, what do we do now? So it really did come down to, at that point, that, you know, $14.8 million over budget. You know, this is the amount we had for general construction. This is what all the bid packages added up to, $76 million. This is what OFPC had approved. We had to get back to $61.3 million. And so what happened was that, and all the details are, you know, gosh, boring, but so, you know, Centex, you know, the original our estimates in construction had gone in based on the design drawings. So, you know, this is what the building's going to look like, these are all the things that are going in, you know, but it wasn't the construction drawings. So the argument was, is that by the time we got to construction drawings, what the bids actually were put in on, is that there was a bunch of creep. You know, well, gosh, you know, we didn't know this is what you meant. And so that's why it came in at $16 million more than what it should have, or $15 million more. So Centex came in the meeting, and boy, this was an uncomfortable meeting, you know, because I'm not doing this kind of stuff usually. And, you know, it was getting pretty nasty. And the Centex guys go, okay, if you guys go back to the design drawings, we'll build it for $61.3 million. Thinking, well, nobody's going to do that. I mean, that can't work. And so, luckily, the guys from Page Butler and Page said, okay, we'll make that work. And that's when Dusty wasn't with Centex anymore after that, because they kind of called his bluff, I think. But, so, it went back to, we will build the building from the design drawings. So we lost almost 6 months, because what had to happen was, Page Sutherland Page and ZGF had to go back and put enough detail in those design drawings rather than the construction drawings to be able to build the building. And so, you know, gosh, we're building along and keep, you know, fixing the design drawings to try to make it work. In the end, it all did. You know, so initially it was a 30-day extension. You know, it ended up that stretched out to a 60-day extension, and then it stretched out to a 6-month extension. So instead of moving in June 30th, you know, it got to where, you know, occupancy was supposed to be 12/31. So we left absolutely no days at the end, no float left, you know, all this kind of good stuff. But, you know, okay, we'll make it work. So by September 2006, when we were supposed to move in by 12/31/06, you know, we had a baseline schedule. We readjusted the baseline in October. We readjusted the baseline for August. You know, okay, this is where we are. But in the end, you know, nobody's going to go home until we move in on 12/31, you know, or 12/13, and it ended up it stretched to 12/31, so we missed by a week and a half, but we were still in by 12/31. You know, so, you know, gosh, all that ended up working out, and I'm just going to give you a few pictures of the space, and then just wrap up here because I've kind of gone on too long probably. But so the cubicles worked out great. Ends up students love them. You know, they sit next to each other. Everybody, you know, the way we have done it is the students kind of pair up. Everybody sits kind of where who they want to sit next to so they can, you know, work really well. It really is a beautiful workspace. It ends up. I mean, you've got all this light. You know, we've ended up putting in some extra benches and stuff here. These are the offices that nobody likes. They're 114 square feet or whatever, you know, the UT system, you know, requirements are. Every office has a window. It just doesn't look outside directly. But a lot of natural light comes into all the offices. Everybody has the same chair. Everybody has everything. This is the faculty office looking out. You know, that's not so bad. Conference rooms. You know, this is one of the large conference rooms. It holds about 25 people. And I was telling the guys yesterday, you know, it was about 3 years before I realized that, you know, if you're sitting out in that corner, you're kind of hanging over there. And I didn't realize that until one day when there was a really big storm and the building's kind of shaking. Holy cow, you know, so I moved my chair up to about there. So what you will see when you look out is that, you know, the views and stuff are as good as we get in Dallas, probably. I mean, this is the open space north of Synergy. But you know, the rooms are extremely nice. I think one of the other things that made it work sort of on schedule, things like, you know, what color carpet, what color walls, what color whatever. We left that all up to the architects. You know, you guys get paid a lot of money to make the building look nice. You tell us what it should be. And essentially, we went with all of their suggestions, you know, rather than, you know, gosh, I don't like red. And in the end, I think it did work out better. I mean, they have people that do that for a living. One of the other things about the building that we tried to do was to make it very easy for people to get together and to communicate and to try to collaborate. So between the first and second floor are these stairways that go up and down, and there's a bunch of, now we've actually had to add some cubicles. The building has gotten so full, we put a few more cubicles around the stairways and all. But it's easy to walk up and down. So the first and second floor together, the third and fourth floor together. It ends up there isn't a stairway between second and third because the building's divided into fire zones and you have to keep the areas separate. But it is easy. And all the elevators are on one end of the building, so in the end, it really is easier for everybody to walk up and down the steps than to walk to the elevator. So it forces the issue to some extent. These are just the little conference rooms on the end. This is looking down the stairway here. This is one of the little conference rooms. Again, until you get in, you're kind of hanging out over the edge and in the conference room. But it makes for very, very nice space for, sort of 10 or 12 people to meet. We have a lot of kids in the building, like our summer students, undergraduates that are working on undergraduate research projects. So we have a lot of space around the stairways where there are chairs, and there's lots of plugs for kids to plug in their computers and wireless, or if you want a wired connection, it's all right there too. So there's lots of space for visitors to be able to sit and spend time in the building as well. Lots of whiteboard for doodling, doing homework. And when you put all that up, I'm sort of thinking, God, wait. There's some kids do actually do their homework there. I mean, a bunch of them will get together and they'll work problems on the board and stuff. So it really has done what the architect said it would do. It's just kind of a picture looking outside. Okay, so, I'm going to wind her up here because I come in talking too long already. So we did get the clean room in. This is just an example of what it looks like now. 5,000 square feet. In my opinion, we have probably one of the best academic clean rooms in the United States. I mean, it was partly because we've got great space. We've had great support from local companies, in terms of helping us with equipment. We have 232 students that use the clean room. And out of that 232, there's probably 150 that use it every week. There's probably 75 that use it every day. I mean, it has been just a tremendous asset to the university. Lots and lots of tools. We've been really fortunate, winning a lot of NSF MRI programs to buy new tools. So, we're full. It's really almost, we probably should have planned for more space. We're to the point already now, we have to take a tool out if we're going to put something new in. I mean, it's almost, the success has been better than we should have expected. So, when I started all this, I said, part of this was to help the university with its growth plan. We want to get to 25,000 kids, $250 million, all that. So, when the building was approved in 2003, we were at $32 million. This year we'll do about $115 million. Now, by no means is that all due to that building, but the faculty that sit in that building probably do roughly $18 million worth of funded research. So, I mean, it is the kind of space you need to be able to hire those folks. And what I tell people a lot is that there are 7 very senior faculty members in that building that we may not have been able to hire if we hadn't had space to be able to show them, gosh, you're going to be part of this 8,000 square feet. Your students are going to be able to sit right here. We've got all this cool stuff. And we've been able to make some great hires, I think, based on the fact that we have. So, some of the lessons learned, just a few. We didn't put in enough faculty offices. It ends up our canonical group wasn't quite right. We have a lot of faculty that don't necessarily have 10 or 12. So we probably should have had another 15 or 20 faculty offices. We were going to do this again. We didn't put any staff offices in. And that was by design. We said, gosh, staff. Most of those guys, they're going to be in the labs and all that. Bad idea. We should have had some staff offices as well. Start planning, we'll move in as early as possible because, boy, when we had to start moving in, there's lots of, oh gosh, who's going to do this, who's going to pay for that? And this is my own, sort of caveat. Make sure the freight elevator is big enough. I've been working on, looking at these plans day in and day out for, 6 months. And, I think, man, we're really sharp. We've thought of everything. And one of the older gentlemen that used to work with me at TI, and he's here now, he's a machinist. I'm showing Tommy the plans, and I'd laid it out in front of him. He hadn't looked at them in about 10 seconds. He goes, Bruce, damn elevator's not big enough. So we had to go back and redesign the elevator, get it all fitted at the end. So when in doubt, make the elevator bigger than it needs to be. And I think with that, this is one of the pictures that it truly is, I think, a beautiful building. I mean, if you haven't had a chance, gosh, I'd be glad to show you guys around, or let you walk through it and see it. But really, it's in pretty stark contrast to the rest of the buildings on campus. But it does look pretty cool. So, thanks.
Questions? We have a few minutes.
Yes, sir.
How about security being
So the building is secured at all times. We have a guard that's there doing normal operating hours to be able to let folks in. But if you're familiar, we use RF tags on our student ID cards and stuff, so you get programmed to be able to get in. So there's security to get into the building. Once you're in the building and get behind the first set of doors, then it's open, but each individual lab also has card key security on too, so we know, who's been in and out of every room that's there. So, I worry about that a tremendous amount, and not so much from that security, more from a safety standpoint. Gosh, you just don't want kids wandering around that don't necessarily, know what they're sticking their fingers in. So yeah, we still worry about that a lot.
So, when you were talking about the mid-3 financial crisis,
Yeah.
how did you find the area to save that money? Was it cutting back on the flexibility?
So we did. I mean, part of it was saving on flexibility. Part of it was things like, when we went from design to construction, and we thought it was in the design, all of the gas piping, we were going to put in electropolished stainless, because that was state of the art. Well, it ended up, we just backed that up to just 316. And so 100,000 here, 200,000 there. And one of the other things that came out is that in the initial package, or what we had hoped there would be enough money to build the animal care facility in the building, we had to take it out of the plan, so that saved some as well. So we had to give up some of the things we wanted and lost a little bit of the flexibility. And it ended up things like the infrastructure for the clean room. Some of that got rolled into the installation rather than the building. We'd hoped that it would have been in the original building cost. So it was ugly. It was really, really, really ugly.
You mentioned that this year UTD will have 150 million. That means UTD is becoming the tier 1 university.
So, so it depends on who defines tier 1, right? Yeah. So, the definition for tier 1 in the state of Texas by the legislature is you have to have $400 million in endowment. You have to have $45 million in restricted research. You have to have 200 PhD graduates a year. So there's some other metrics. By our standard, we absolutely feel like we're on track to being tier 1. If you look at the schools that we want to be like, $200 million, and when we get dinged on all these things, we're not very big yet, and the only reason I remember these numbers is because I was just doing them the other day. UT Austin, on average, $250,000 a year in research funding per faculty. Texas A&M is about $220. Except we're about $160, but the next closest is $85. We have great faculty, we just don't have enough of them yet. We need to continue to grow, but we will, hopefully, maybe we better, we will be tier 1. There's not a doubt in my mind that we'll be there. Yes, sir.
Could you briefly just share maybe one or two of the research projects that's been in there in the last 3 years?
Sure. So, we have a lot of work in electronic materials. We have a big material science group that mainly does electronic materials. So it's where do you go after silicon is finished? So, if you keep up with the popular science, graphene is all the rage these days. Graphene is a single layer of carbon or a single layer of graphite. Mobility is going to be 10 times what silicon is. Devices will run 10 times faster. And also, a lot of work in those kinds of areas. We also have a lot of work with guys that are working on sensors for medical devices. So Walter Hu, for instance, one of our young faculty, he makes nanowire transistors where you coat the nanowires with a particular antibody or antigen. I may have this backwards, but then if you flow whatever the right solution is, maybe your saliva, maybe the things will bind selectively to that nanowire. If it binds, you actually change the transport characteristics of the nanowire, and from that, the transistor changes how it operates. And you can tell, and the goal there is that you can detect one molecule of, whatever that is that you're looking for. So, for instance, one of their big things for that particular nanowire technology is, for prostate cancer, it ends up, PSA is what everybody measures, that there are actually tumor cells in your bloodstream years before the PSA is sensitive to pick it up. But if you could actually go in and try to look for those individual cells and do the concentration, you could tell years ahead of time. So a lot of, how do you, and to me, that's kind of the reason I use that one. It's a great example of what we do, because Walter sits next to two biologists. I mean, Walter's like me, he's more of an electrical engineer. He wouldn't do an antigen if it hit him upside the head, probably. But, because the biologists sit next to him, Walter says, gosh, I make these really cool nanowire transistors. What else might I do with them? And so there's a bunch of stuff like that, I think, that goes on. It makes it pretty neat. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about cross-disciplinary approach across the sciences. It strikes me that research fundamentally is a series of projects. Are you doing anything cross-pollinating ideas with the project management school?
We're not very good at that. We have one guy, though, Kumar, who actually is in the School of Management, who sits there because he happens to be a material scientist as well. So, it is something that has to do more of, and this is a personal example, and hopefully we will do more of this. National Science Foundation runs a particular solicitation that they call Partnerships for Innovation. We like to make some little widgets that are called multi-electrode arrays. You grow cells on them, and you look at the electrical responses of those cells. Well, as for this project for innovation, what we have to do is work with somebody in the School of Management and 3 local companies to take that technology to market. And so part of the reason I think we got funded is because, and Bob Robb, who is our technology commercialization, Bob actually helped us put together, this is how big this market could be, these are the potential customers, helped us find customers, and we put all that together. In that particular case, it's worked really neat, and it's a new program, just got started a few months ago, but we need to certainly do a whole lot more of that, because from a funding standpoint even, the National Science Foundation, while it is the National Science Foundation, they do science, they keep getting pushed by Congress, what is the impact of this $8 billion a year we spend on science? Where are the jobs coming? Where are, the things that are being fixed? So we need to do a whole lot better about that. And one big advantage, because we got a great School of Management, we ought to be doing a lot more of that to take advantage of it. And I'm probably talking too long.
No, that's right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
One small example of what's happening on this campus, and we appreciate you sharing with us a lot of stuff I didn't know. And I said a couple of years ago, the older I get, things happened 5 years ago, I think happened last year, but it's a beautiful building, and this campus is just exploding like that in all directions. I do take issue with something you said. You said, first thing out of your mouth, I'm not a project manager. The second overhead you put up was the requirements of stakeholders. Something doesn't connect. But anyhow.
But yeah, no, if I had to make a living being a project manager, I'd go pretty hungry.
But anyhow, as a scientist, I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do with wine glasses and a
But we'll
decanter.
figure it out.